as you know, Brian Clark and I have managed to hold several meetings. I don't know what the total number is. It's getting close to double digits, I think, if it hasn't already. Um, about AUKUS nominally, but more generally, what is it that the United States, its European allies, and its Asian allies should be doing together? Uh, Mostly, we're focused on defense-related high technology projects. We've tried to make it kind of like AUKUS Plus rather than just AUKUS. But occasionally, we check to see whether AUKUS is in a healthy state or listing to port, no pun intended. Uh, we're trying actually for the next gathering to get a French speaker because don't tell anybody, but the British and Americans are having a hard time getting their act together to put together a submarine. And I think the Australians actually know this. And I think the French know this. And I think we know this. But for some reason, it's a forbidden topic to talk about. So I thought, well, come on. We're going to come up with a proposal, I suspect, that will say something like, well, the UK, Australia, and the US should work on a brand new design. That's code for, oh my God, it's going to come even later. So I thought maybe we should see if we could find any Frenchmen with a sense of humor to come back and talk about nuclear submarines that they might build. Anyway, I hope everyone can smile and enjoy that gathering if we get that together. So we're working on that. Tonight, perhaps we're going even further out on the ledge. All of the people I know who are very smart and experienced, and they're not, there are not so many of those people around when it comes to Korea and things having to do with nuclear weapons, are pretty much whispering they're going to get them, or they should get them, or maybe we should bring them over there. And there's a lot of talk about this. And the president of Korea, of course, as I mentioned in the invite, has voiced his opinion that, well, perhaps they'll have to look at this. Now, for a president of South Korea to say that publicly is pretty remarkable. Why? Well, the United States has leaned on South Korea to stay away from that historically, more than once. More than once. And of course, many of the things that the United States did in the 70s were quite provocative and encouraging the South Koreans to go their own way. And when we pulled out of Vietnam and we made nice with the Chinese, I mean, it made the South Koreans reasonably nervous. And so they're nervous again. And all of our allies are nervous. And maybe we need to be a little more nervous. But the problem with going nuclear, several. It's not an easy course of action. It could complicate the ability to fight together conventionally, because these things have to be protected, and they tend to be targets. There are questions of who's going to shoot them, if ever, and who's going first. It isn't, the dual key system in NATO is controversial enough. But if South Korea, or for that matter, let's get creative, Japan, because if South Korea goes, it's going to be very hard to keep the Japanese from going. Where does this end? I like to remind my Australian friends of their nuclear weapons program. They don't like to admit that historically ever happened. It did. And, okay, you say, well, what's the problem? Friends, everyone has these things. Well, a few more get it. Well, so what? I think it's unclear where that, story ends. I don't think it's clear that it's a big plus. It could easily be a big negative, and a lot of uncertainties. Now, having done that drum roll for everybody, why are we going to be talking about space? Well, I always say if you have a difficult topic uh, at a family gathering, you always count on somebody in the family, maybe your mother or your aunt, to interrupt and change the subject. And then you get through the dinner, and it's not so bad. uh, I don't know if this is possible. It may not be. But even if it isn't, I think we do need to talk about something else easily, and perhaps as of such strategic significance as nuclear weapons. Well, what would that be? I think it might be related to space. And the reason I say that is the United States and Great Britain and France are going to fall behind in the number of weapons. They already have as the Chinese ramp up. And the idea that we're going to make everything good again by making more nuclear weapons and more intercontinental missiles, I don't know. It doesn't sound right to me. It's probably not going to happen for a lot of just logistical administrative reasons. We're very bad at it now. We go slow and they're very expensive to build. So rather than try to match or overmatch the Russians and Chinese with nuclear warheads and ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, um, you might want to get into the ring and instead of having, fists of made of nuclear weapons delivered by long arms in the form of missiles, you might want to recognize that they've got more fists. They may have more missiles, but you can still stun them by punching them in the head. That kind of stunning uh, has to do with making it very difficult for them to control, command, and communicate with those forces. Much of that will depend on who has command of space. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So I thought, well, we better get somebody to start changing the subject and tell us what they can tell us about space and how, if at all, we can do a much more serious job of collaborating. I'd say not only with the South Koreans, but the South Koreans probably in their own way could be more important, but also the Japanese. And while we're at it, our friends who don't ski in the winter down in the South. Sam Wilson is someone who I met because he was a student of mine. And despite that, he did quite well and ended up doing aerospace work for the Aerospace Corporation. And he is one of their experts, I think it's fair to say, about South Korea and Japan and what kinds of projects of military significance and commercial are going on and what could go on. So I lucked out having him as a student because now he can do something to help me, and teach us. Uh, General Inbom Chung is someone, if you know anything about Korea, probably wouldn't need any introduction. And he, in fact, is the most decorated Korean military officer there is. And so he has had positions of responsibility uh, in the Korean military and the Joint Command. He writes, he speaks. He probably knows more about America than a lot of American citizens because he did a lot of growing up here in the United States. So he is perhaps. I hope I don't embarrass anybody, but you're kind of like a Korean Colin Powell for us, at least. All right, and I think you have views about nuclear weapons and space. So I thought I'd have you comment. Sam, why don't you proceed? And what we'll do is have the general comment, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
That's great. Thank you, Henry. I've never had my talk likened to the awkward family member who brings up a topic at the family dinner to mitigate some of the tension. So this is a first for me. But thanks, Henry, and thanks for Brian for organizing this and asking me. And it's of course a huge honor to be here with General Yoon. And I will just note before I begin that he is an expert, and I'm kind of offering it just a kind of U.S. perspective looking at this. I'd also note, I look at the title of the event, might increased space cooperation keep Asia from going nuclear. I will most certainly not be answering that question, but I hope I can talk a little bit about the prospects for more integrated U.S. South Korean defense space collaboration, and you can draw your own conclusions about what that means for the prospect of nuclear proliferation in the region. So to begin, I would just start with a couple of general trends that we see in space. One is what we in our center often call the democratization of space. Space is becoming increasingly democratized, in contrast with the past, in which space was dominated by a few major government powers. Now there are over 70 countries that own or operate satellites in orbit. Another trend is this increasing commercialization of space. In 2012, 60% of the active satellites in orbit were owned by governments, and most of the remaining 40% were owned by private companies. Now that ratio has flipped. It's more than flipped. Over nearly 3/4 of the active satellites in orbit are owned by commercial actors, and around 1/4 of active spacecraft are owned by governments. That trend is set to continue with commercial companies having a larger share in the years ahead. And just one example, SpaceX is often on the news. SpaceX's Starlink constellation, they're planning to put 40,000 satellites in orbit, which is many more times the number of satellites that we currently have in orbit. We have about 6,000 satellites in total. So that would fundamentally shift the amount of activity we've grown accustomed to in space. So both these trends, this democratization in space and commercializations of space, I think are important for thinking about South Korea and the U.S., the prospects of more integrated defense space operations between South Korea and the United States. The democratization is important because it speaks to more opportunity, right? As more countries, as more allies and partners in the United States develop more space capabilities and more sophisticated space capabilities, this creates more opportunity for the U.S. to try to leverage some of these opportunities. And we are starting to. This year, we're putting a payload on a Norwegian satellite. It'll be a national security communications payload. This and next year, we're planning to put national security payloads on Japanese navigation satellites, their QZSS systems. With Norway, that'll be the first time we've ever put an active national security payload on a foreign satellite. In the case of Japan, that'll be the first time we've ever put an active national security payload on a foreign satellite and foreign launcher, right? So, in contrast with the past, when our international space collaboration was mostly limited to civil space activity, we're now starting to do more with defense collaboration with our allies and partners. With respect to South Korea, I think they should be seen as an extremely attractive partner for defense-based collaboration with the United States. Um, I mentioned the commercialization of space as a trend, and I talked about this in the paper that Henry forwarded. But South Korea is really focusing. If you look in some of their policy documents, they're really focusing on how we can leverage some of the commercial activity in South Korea and foreign commercial activity, and how they can build up their own space industry in the country. They also have already sophisticated capabilities and really ambitious plans for their government systems, their national space capabilities. They're ranked in the top 10 in terms of spending on space. They have an array of remote sensing satellites. This past year, they launched Nuri, which is their own domestic rocket. They launched their own satellite and their own rocket. So they became in this. They got in this very small group of countries that can have the ability to independently launch into orbit. They also launched their rover this year. So 2022 was a really huge year for South Korea. And I think when you look at their sophistication right now, their space capabilities, and where they want to go, I think it's particularly striking because South Korea had a later start to space than other major powers. By the time that South Korea had its first satellite in orbit, over 20 countries already had satellites in orbit. They were really kind of 3 decades behind a lot of the other major powers. So it's again, I think this is a sign of kind of what they've been able to do in a small period of time, but also what they're going to do moving forward, which I think is that perspective look, I think is really important when we're thinking about how the U.S. should prioritize defense-based collaboration. And one planned capability, I talked a little bit about this in the paper that Henry forwarded, but one planned capability that I want to highlight is Japan's navigation satellites. They're developing what's called KPS, the Korean Positioning System, and this would be, I think, really significant as a symbol of the maturity of South Korea's space development. There are only 6 PNT satellite systems in the world: U.S. GPS, China's Beidou, Galileo, Europe's Galileo, GLONASS, Russia, India's, I forget the name, and then QZSS for Japan. So really exclusive group of countries, the sort of creme de la creme of space systems South Korea would be developing. And I think it's not just important in that this shows the emergence of South Korea as a true space power, but I think it's also a really compelling area for us, for the United States, to target as an area for more integrated collaboration. If thinking about some of the examples I just mentioned about using payloads, putting payloads on Japanese satellites, on Norwegian satellites, if we were to do that with the Korean navigation satellites, if we were to put US GPS payloads on those satellites, you would have much greater precision and performance of PNT over a pretty critical area of the world, right? Like you'd be covering a lot swaths of Eastern China. So I think that could be really compelling. Also, if you used encrypted US GPS payloads, then you'd have more resiliency as well. And I think this approach of integrating capabilities, is really advantageous for a couple reasons. One is just cost, right? You're able to do a lot more in space than you would otherwise if you had to actually pay for not just the payload, but for the satellite and for in some cases the launch, right? So the Norway example is projected to save the United States up to $900 million on what it would have cost us otherwise. And I don't have the figures on the QZSS, but that one we're not even launching, right? So it could be saving pretty significant dollar figures. And then there's the resiliency deterrence advantages of this too, right? You're able to, if you're interoperable with partner or allied systems, you have a more resilient architecture, harder for an adversary to undermine. And then if you have if you have joint capabilities like what we're talking about, then I think it could change the calculus of the adversary, right? Because now if you're attacking a satellite, you're not just attacking a U.S. system, but you're also attacking a Korean system or a Japanese system or a Norwegian system, or all the countries who are involved, and that that risk of collective response could deter the attack from taking place to begin with. So I think there's a lot of really good reasons for the U.S. and South Korea to think about integrated capabilities, and I think that this the PNT area is a really compelling one to focus. And if they were to do this, they should start deciding that soon, because integrating these capabilities takes a really long time. And we actually have eventually I'll have another paper coming out, and we have some folks doing an analysis on what that PNT added resiliency coverage would look like if we were to do this model. So I think there is just tremendous opportunity here, but there are still some issues that need to be thought through that I just want to mention. One is China. With South Korea, a lot of our focus from a defense perspective is on North Korea, and part of that I think is because South Korea's closest economic partner is China. I think that's changing, but not the economic relationship is changing, but the more we can talk about China is changing. But when we think about space, a lot of our focus from a military perspective and from a defense space operations perspective is China, right? So I think that's an important. I wouldn't say it's an issue, but it's an area that's sensitive, or that at least has been sensitive. And so that's something it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Another challenge or issue that I wanted to mention is South Korea is maturing and kind of how they think about their governance structure for space policy making. So I think this is a really opportune time, not just for the U.S. South Korean defense space relationship, but also for not just in terms of what South Korea is developing, but also in kind of their growth internally. When I was in South Korea I was in Seoul in October, and I heard a lot of whispers that they were going to be changing, reforming their governance structure, and I heard these changes were going to come in their 5-year space policy plan, and that came out a week and a half ago. So this is really exceptional timing, Brian and Henry, on this event. Unfortunately, I can't offer many insights on this plan because it's in Korean. So I'm still trying to tease these out, but I would love to hear if General Choon has any thoughts on the space policy plan. My understanding is that South Korea was kind of grappling with some of the same issues that Japan has been grappling with, and that a lot of focus now is on their military space activity, but a lot of their expertise has been on the civilian side, and with Japan that was in JAXA, and in South Korea that's been typically in CARI. And so kind of thinking about, and now they have this they have ADD in South Korea, but still a lot of that history and experience has been on CARI. And so kind of thinking about how to convert, translate that expertise and experience, and what role the Ministry of Defense should have versus MSIT. So again, excited to hear what General Choon has to say on this. I would just conclude with, Henry's asked me to talk about this topic several times over the last couple of years, about the prospects of kind of U.S. South Korean defense-based collaboration, and I point out in that paper, that there's some things that we're doing, but it's not a lot. And usually my talk, I always think, is like kind of a call to action. It's South Korea is a really attractive country to target, but we're not, right? And there should be more collaboration between the U.S. and South Korea in this regard, but it's just not happening. And I feel differently. I'm much more optimistic today. I think we're actually there's a lot more attention on South Korea for space within the Pentagon. I think I'm much more hopeful that in the next couple of years there's going to be some progress. I think the next couple of years are going to be really telling for what we see in this relationship in the future. So I will stop there and turn it over back to you, Henry.
Yes. Hold on here. Okay, despite everything. Uh, General, why don't we go directly to you? Because I think looking at the lineup of participants, we have some very high powered experts, and it'd be great to get them involved talking as well. But I think you can set up things even more from a Korean perspective, and we're eager to hear what you have to say.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you could be a little louder.
Yeah, I've been having problems here.
Well, we can hear
This
you.
is, yeah, okay. So before anything else, I just want to express that I have my Star Trek t-shirt on. So it's not only smarts and experience, but a good sense of humor that will save us all from the quagmire that we're in. So I just want to remind everybody that even us Asians have a sense of humor, or some of us do. Anyway, indulge me. Uh, Secondly, we, you know, Henry, there's always the uncle who has to bring back the subject. But I just want to say that when President Yoon mentioned his nuclear comment, a lot of hype came out of the media that it was, the first time that a Korean president mentioned nuclear weapons in decades. But he put a lot of ifs and buts before he said that. So I just want to remind everybody that this was a option that the Koreans are uh, looking at, but there's a lot of things that must happen. Secondly, uh, concerning the nuclear weapons, there were surveys done for the Koreans on why they wanted nuclear weapons. So who's looking at the Korean Peninsula knows that 2 out of 3 Koreans want nuclear weapons, but not very people not very many people have asked these Koreans why you want nuclear weapons. Well, the number one reason that came out was the insecurities from China. So it was kind of a surprise for many Americans because many Americans thought it was because the Koreans didn't trust them. So it wasn't just about not trusting the Americans or extended deterrence, but it was about China. The second item that came out was national pride. And I think this was something that was lost in translation. No, we don't think that nuclear weapons is going to enlarge our pride. If it did, North Korea would be the proudest nation in the world. What it means is for the past 5,000 years, we Koreans have been attacked from the north and the south and the east and the west. So a lot of us in our instincts believe that with nuclear weapons, we will have a deterrent that will protect us. So I think that this national prestige item that came out is probably an interpretation of that rather than, being proud to have nuclear weapons. The third reason that the Koreans wanted nuclear weapons was, of course, North Korea and the threatening actions that they're showing nearly every day now. So that was the third one. And the fourth was our doubts about, extended deterrence, which comes from many, many reasons. So I just wanted to make that clear. Now, shifting back to space. So, except for this Star Trek uh, costume, I will confess, a Trekkie. So, let's get that over. But I'm not a space expert. But in order to do this today, I did speak to a lot of people, some of which was in Sam's thesis. They tell me that we are about 25 to 30 years behind Japan. So they said, uh, we're starting now. We're being very aggressive, as you said. We want to have a NASA kind of agency that will coordinate all our efforts. We're going to put in money into this. We're giving a hefty conditions for scientists working in the field. For instance, not only higher wages, but job security, which a lot of these scientists lacked. So there's a lot of initiatives going on, which is very exciting. But this is, again, we're at the beginning stages. We have to put money into it. We have to write laws into it and all that. The good news, it seems, is bipartisan. The bad news is we live in a democracy. So every 5 years, somebody's going to change their mind. And so we face a lot of challenges. As you know, we're building rockets. Satellite designs are being made and built. And as I said, technology and policy are being developed. For space traffic management and space situational awareness, it seems it's only now that the Koreans realize that we need to get involved in this and that we now recognize that it is a serious issue. But it's not all the Koreans. In fact, a lot of the officials, the government officials, don't really realize that it is in our best interest to get involved in these STM and SSC issues. So there's a lot of things that need to be done. Cooperation-wise, the good news is that the Koreans need help. They want help in not only technology, but setting policies. So when I heard this, I thought, well, I hope the world, specifically the United States, don't want us to sign another NPT type of deal where, we get excluded in the future for something now. I don't think that's the kind of policy that we want to get involved in, but saying that, we want to be a part of the team. So I think right now is a good opportunity for the United States and our good neighbor, Japan, to help us with this 25, 30-year gap, shorten it a little, 10 years, get on the favorable side, and while you're at it, set policies together with the Koreans that will benefit the three nations. And the Koreans get an accelerated program, which they will get in the end anyway. The United States, is able to put in their policy requirements, and Japan can, I believe, open an inroad to better relations with Korea if we are able to have a programs that will be seen by the public that says, Japan has really stepped up and helped the Koreans. Again, I would like to remind everyone, we're going to get there. We Koreans are going to get there anyway. Now, why don't you just, if I were you guys, I'd just help a little, get on the favorable side, and the three of us reap the benefits. Because, it's not just this, but like I said, I'm a Trekkie. So I believe in space, the final frontier, and maybe there's something out there that's better than us right now. And I think this cooperation, although it's about, garbage that we threw into space around Earth that's now creating some dangers for us. It's not just about that, but maybe this is an area where we can really do some good for humanity. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, there's a plea. What I'd like is to work as follows. If you have a question or comment, if you could make sure you just go into the chat room and indicate that, my staff will make sure that I don't ignore you, or we don't ignore you, number one. And number two, if there's something that's absolutely related to the comment that's being made, it's like a two-finger intervention, just raise your hand. We'll see it and we'll call on you. Okay, well, no sooner did I say that than Brian Chow has entered the fray. Brian, why don't you turn on your mic? Brian? Brian Chow. Are you there? All right. Well, while he's trying to figure out how to get going, let me ask
Okay,
a
now
question.
can you hear me?
Well, despite everything, you've joined us. Okay. Over to you. Okay.
So let me start over again.
Okay. Now,
So basically,
remember, we don't. I want to warn everyone. Try to make your comments brief enough that it encourages more discussion. All right.
Okay, so to make it brief, basically I enjoy listening to both of you on that. But the general presumption is that, well, US can always use some help. So we get help from Korea, we get help from Japan and other countries, then we are better. But what I'm telling you, the most important thing is for US to get the help that we really want, and we are not getting it. US is not asking for it, and Japan and South Korea are not aware of it. So let me try to explain what I meant. I think the best way is we start 2 years ago, that Henry conducted a China space war game showing China can disable about, let me turn my on. So in that war game, we concluded that by 2029 that China can destroy about 100 of our satellites. Now, by the way, GPS is only 32 satellites. So that is the problem. And afterward, I updated the data. So it's not 2029, but it's 2026. So, and that is very consistent with what President Xi Jinping said. Well, now we can advance our capability to take Taiwan by force from 2035 to 2027. So here's the big question. So all we are talking about, all these surveillance, commercial things, and all these things, it will take time, like both Sam and General Chun said. It takes time. So what can we do in the next 3 years so that we can counter the Chinese capability of destroying 100 of our satellites, about 100 of them? Okay, nobody talks about it. US doesn't quite talk about it. So what's the conclusion? I think the most important thing, because Henry asked us, what's the most important program? To me, the most important program is for our airlines to ask the United States, hey, you say that you need our help, but just tell me, how are you going to protect your satellites? Keep asking questions in order to have a wake-up call to the US so that they do the most important thing. As you know, if we cannot protect our satellites, certainly we will not intervene. And if we intervene, then we're going to lose the war. So to answer, actually, Henry makes me to think about the important question. The most important question of what the space cooperation should give to countries is not just to help Taiwan, not help South Korea and Japan, but to help US to have a wake-up call to realize we are now have a major trouble in our space vulnerability. So to wake us up, to make us to look into that issue in the next 3 years, not the next decade. Okay, all the things we are doing is for next decade. So we are in big trouble this decade. So thank you.
Okay, well, that was pretty good. Does anyone want to pick up on that, or is that just sort of like noise in a crowded room? Okay, well, there you have it. No one knows what to
Okay.
do with it. Uh, let's see here. Melissa, uh, perhaps you can play with that a little. Why don't you repeat your question and you can comment as well?
Okay, thank you. Please forgive the slightly self-interested focus of the question, obviously, but and Sam does sort of refer to the relevance of this, towards the end of his paper. But Australia is in, I suppose, the same slice of observation of the skies, of the heavens, as Korea and Japan. And there have been some movements in commercial provision of space situational awareness. But I suppose my question is, we're talking about kind of bilateral or trilateral arrangements. Is it better to, what are our thoughts about building things out bilaterally and then kind of bringing them all together? Or should we be just talking more broadly about a more multilateral way of dealing with these issues? So I'd be really interested to see how you think, incrementally we can bring like-minded partners together. And there is a certain amount of self-interest in this too, because of course Australia sort of has a bit of on again, off again ambivalence to supporting its own space industry. So I was really interested to hear about the very specific sort of South Korean government support for a NASA-like agency and investing in science and those sorts of things. So how do we work together on the things that you've said, but building them out a bit beyond the parties that we've talked about?
Good question, Henry. Should I take this?
Yeah, well, don't jump all at once.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wasn't sure if you're taking other questions too. Yeah, Melissa, great question. I think, I think there are certain areas where that lend themselves to more multilateral activity than others. Thinking about norms developments, Nick Gleason is on this call. He's been really focusing on this. I think that's obviously a really important area for multilateralism, and and then with some civil space activity, we've also taken a multilateral approach in the past. With defense space collaboration, though, we just really haven't done much, and so we're kind of starting at this bilateral level. At least there's been some talks about interoperability, but sort of this integration approach that I talked about with respect to Norway with that satellite, with our EPSR, our communications payload, with the Japanese navigation satellites, and what I kind of proposed for the Korean navigation satellites. That's really, really new. Again, as I said, this is the first time we've ever done this, and we haven't done it yet, right? So this integration approach, I think, is one way you think about deterrence and defense-based collaboration. But I would like to see some bilateral efforts before we got to more trilateral, more multilateral efforts. But I think in general, yes, we've had several countries, including Japan and South Korea, sign up to the U.S.-led initiative to ban destructive ASATs. There's a lot of I think really important initiatives that we're working on with respect to Australia. But I think with respect to some of this more integration, we're just still pretty early on.
Sam, what if Brian's right? Wouldn't it suggest that the Five Eyes needs a couple of extra sockets? I mean, there's a kind of waltzing past the graveyard here that is quite weird.
Yeah, I fully expect any day to read the news that Japan is at the CSPOC. Sorry, the Combined Space Operations Center. We have the Five Eyes there. We have France and Germany there now. I think Japan is the country I keep hearing is going to come. I could see South Korea being after that. So I think we're trying to get there. And with the Five Eyes, we've had, this long history. But it's still, again, it's, we talked about South Korea being, General Chun said, South Korea is 30 years behind. I don't know if I would say they're 30 years behind now, but yes, they started 30 years after Japan. And so, and traditionally a lot of the most mature space countries have been kind of our adversaries, right? So outside of the United States. So now when we're seeing a lot of our allies and partners develop space capabilities and becoming more mature, this is I think a really great opportunity to start doing more with them with respect to defense.
Ms. Gates, Michelle? Michelle Gates?
Hi, good evening. Sorry, I'm always slow with my mic. Just wanted to share, I have some colleagues who worked on the KPLO, the Korean Lunar Pathfinder Orbiter mission that launched in August of last year. And the pictures from the NASA camera are just being released now. I just posted a link to a blog, pictures a couple weeks ago. They are quite an achievement as compared to the previous set that we had. There were 5 instruments on the orbiter. I mean, it was quite an achievement in my view, and also a joint mission between Korea and NASA. So I just wanted to offer that information to the group.
Okay.
Would you like to say anything about that, Sam?
I'm really glad, Michelle, you know more about it than I do.
Okay.
I'm really kind of focused on the defense side, but
Okay.
I think it's a great thing to point out. And, and I think it's also worth, I just want to contextualize. We do have a great history of
Right.
doing collaborative stuff in civil space, including for a long time with Russia, right? I mean, this is, for about a 9-year, 10-year stretch, we used Russian rockets to get our astronauts to the ISS, right? So it's worth pointing that out. We've had this really great civil space activity for a really long time, and some of that activity, some of that partnership with Russia suffered after Crimea, and now it's really suffering. But this has been always a lot of multilateralism with respect to civil space.
Yes, there were a lot of paths carved with this mission, I understand, State Department agreements, etc. And the U.S. provided communication navigation. So PNT, I think, was provided by the U.S. and the launch was SpaceX. Orbit insertion was also done by SpaceX, is my understanding just from reading the information. But I agree with you. And I was thinking as you were talking, Sam, that one of the things that the civil space provides is a foundation. It can provide a foundation of trust. Parts get delivered back and forth. Each party makes commitments to dates, makes commitments to deliveries, assigns people that develop relationships, expertise in these areas that require dependency. And so I think it goes a lot. I mean, there's a lot that comes out of the collaboration. So I just want to add, thank you.
Greg Odekirk has a question, which I think, again, might drive home, what it is that we need to be focused on. I mean, if it is the case that we have some security issues in space, how do things work? Do we need to quicken the pace? Do we need to collaborate more? What are the barriers? Craig, why don't you ask your question?
Sure, I'll be glad to do that. Back in the past, in my military studies, we discussed policies and the cultures of China, and I've had a long association with the Korean community here in Utah. I did a battle book trip to South Korea back in 1988, when we were studying how we were going to defend the peninsula from the north. And our mission was to work with the Trans-Korean pipeline to make sure we got fuel up north in case of a big conflict. But in my studies with the Asian culture, I understand that the Asians have a very long-term position when it comes to goals and their policies. As opposed to the United States, our goals and policies are based on the current 4-term policy of the current administration and whatever the current Congress seems to be able to get out of the situation there. We have a different approach to doing things. And as an example, back in World War II, we promised Czechoslovakia that we were going to help them after the war, but when it came down to it, we abandoned them and let the Russians take over, and they became part of the Soviet bloc. And so when we don't keep our promises, everybody is looking at us. And
do you have a question?
Yes.
I thought you did.
How do we?
I was very seized with the question. Why don't you make it?
Well, the question is, how do we maintain a long-term continuity between our support of a country? If we have a support of Korea and Japan today, how do we make sure that continues into the next U.S. administration? Or is that something beyond what we can do?
Well, by the way, why don't we? There's an additional question, Mr. Takamizawa. I think it's related to Mr. Oderkirk's question. Could you ask it as well? And then maybe we should have some discussion about the questions, both questions, which are quite related. Could you make your question to the group? If you could turn on your mic. Well, I'll read the question because you're having. Are Japan and South Korea ready to work together as Japan, as in the Japan-Australia security cooperation, which includes many areas of cooperation? What are the obstacles to that, number one? Number two, just to put a sharper edge on the Oderkirk question, are there sources of distrust of South Korea that need to be addressed with regard to tech transfer? What is it? Does anybody know? I mean, are we totally without agency to understand why this is not happening? I'm going to turn it over to you, Sam, first.
Yeah, I'll just offer an anecdote that I thought was pretty interesting that I think is hopefully helpful to this question. So I mentioned I was in Seoul in October, and I was speaking at a conference there actually because General Yoon had me invited, and I was talking about a similar talk. I was talking about the prospects for more collaborative U.S. South Korean defense space operations and more collaborative U.S.-Japanese defense space operations. Kind of talking about those two cases, but I didn't really talk about trilateral because of I understanding the kind of cultural sensitivities. But there was a general who responded to my comments, the discussant, and he said, "I think we should go much further than what Sam said. I hear what Sam said, but I think we need to be doing lots of trilateral integration when we think about defense space capabilities. We need to be doing this." And afterwards, the defense attaché to the embassy was there, and he said, "I've never heard. I've been here for 3 years. I've never heard as high-ranking of a Korean official say that." So anyway, I just bring that up in that I do think that things could be changing in this regard, and I'll ask that to General Yoon his thoughts but I thought that was a really interesting comment and one that I've thought about since.
General?
Yeah. Okay. So, before I go into that, I just want to relay that the Korean government just announced yesterday that they will establish a NASA JASA type of agency by December of this year. That they've already established a task force of 15 government experts and scientists to reach this goal. That the National Space Committee that will set all the policies and way ahead for Korean space policy, which is now headed by the Prime Minister, will now be headed by the President himself. So I guess this space initiative will be a top priority for the Koreans. And now going back to the comment in question, according to a recent survey, 80% of the Korean people do not like China. According to the same survey, 7% of the Koreans don't like the United States.
70 or 7?
7.
7. Well, that's
Yeah, it
good.
was like 7.6. So we're gonna have these people, everywhere.
Yeah.
60% said they don't like Japan, and I think the feeling is mutual in our neighbor islands. Now, having said that, for a guy like me, half glass full, half glass empty, I would say 40% support or like Japan from a Korean perspective. And if you go to any street, you cannot imagine how many Japanese restaurants are around here. I mean, the common people, besides the survey, like Japanese food, and they don't have any ill feelings. Just recently, because of the lift or relaxation of COVID, an influx of tourists occurred in Korea. And in Japan, 1 out of every 3 tourists was a Korean. And I think the stats were similar. So, all this ill feelings has a lot of twists and turns to it. And for a guy like me, there's hope. Having said that, I attended the Emperor's birthday reception last week. Now, guys, I'm the kind of person who is open, and I feel everybody deserves the right to be happy, blah blah blah. But I have the highest respects for Japan. I look to the future of my people rather than the past and all that. But when the Japanese national anthem, the Kimi Gayo, was played in that reception, man, it scared me. And I haven't been scared of Japan in a long time. So I think we
could you
must
explain
remember,
why? Why were you scared?
Henry, I think, for nearly
Was there
40
something?
years.
I'm not familiar with the anthem.
Yeah. So it was the same anthem that was played during the Japanese occupation. So for us Koreans, we're human beings. So we think with our head and we feel with our heart. And on that moment, my human feelings were scared. So I think this is something important that Japan must understand about Koreans. And oftentimes I try to explain to Americans the African American community that you have. If you were to tell an African American person to, get off it, we've already had a black president and there's equality in American society, that's not going to fly. I mean, my Japanese friends tell me, how many times do I have to say I'm sorry? But I'm sorry, you got to say this like 10 million times. Not to me, but that's just the way that it is. And I really think that for me, I really think that 40% is a great number because that's higher than the approval rating for my president right now. So let's work with that. And for the participants, especially the Japanese participants here, you must be the ones that first understand the feelings of the Koreans and use space and the advantage that you hold right now to win the hearts of the 40% and then make that 60% and 80%, which I think it will be easy. You know, the 20% they'll never change. But the trick is to get it to 80%. And so I think space is a great opportunity to do so. And yes, I really believe that we have a great opportunity because Koreans need help, Japan can help us, and the United States can moderate. Thank you.
Well, looking at the numbers, I'm inclined to let's see if we have any more folks in the chat room. No, we don't. If someone would like to ask a question or make a comment, I would suggest that it be the closing one, or we can close now. We've gone an hour, and they say virtual reality ends at 90 minutes. I think it more likely ends at 60. So, any final comments or thoughts from anyone?
Ambassador Abe has his hand raised.
Well, that's appropriate. Ambassador, why don't you close out with your comment or question?
I wish to put the question to Henry. The theme of this meeting is how space cooperation promotion can reduce the risk of nuclear proliferation. I thought that was your theme.
Yes, well, that was the thinking.
We have not talked about this question of linkage between space cooperation and nuclear proliferation. And I wonder how, Henry, you came to think about this theme.
Well, it's very simple. It's something that, you know, NPEC has been pushing now for about 4 or 5 years. You're probably not going to be able to compete quantitatively against both China and Russia in the game of nuclear ICBM warheads. We already have fewer ICBM warheads than China. We already do. Never mind China plus Russia. Now, you know, I think a lot of people want to make America great again by just doing what we did in the 50s. The only problem is that the ability to make a large number of warheads and make a large number of ICBMs is not there. If you think we have a problem with nuclear submarines, check out how long it takes the Department of Energy to make a warhead. You got to have lots of time on your hands, to say nothing of lots of money. And the same it goes for ICBMs. Lockheed takes forever. So if the competition is just quantitative, I think, and it's only nuclear and it's only ICBMs, I think we're in big trouble. I don't think it is that, though. I think space is a fulcrum that makes anyone's arms, anyone's fists meaningless if, in fact, they don't have brain function that's optimal to make those things work. The future is going to be in competitions that have to do with controlling the ability of others to control the forces they have. In that regard, we have certain advantages, though, you know, I don't know how long we will, but we have them. And, you know, Japan and South Korea do an awful lot of important work in computing and in secure communications. I cannot imagine that Europe and the United States is going to do everything by themselves in these fields. Question is, will the United States, will these other countries see each other more as equals, secure their technology against leakage, That's a big question. We didn't talk about that. And if they do, I don't think we have that much to worry about with regard to China and Russia. If we don't, I don't see how we're going to compete properly. I think Brian Chow is right as well. We are taking the most leisurely approach to the threat, which is, I think, totally inappropriate. So you asked. I don't know if that's a coherent answer. You tell me.
Okay. If I may, since you gave this question to the session, I thought over the issue. Certainly, I think space cooperation, or in a broader sense, intelligence cooperation between Japan and the US, intensification of it, will help reduce the Japanese appetite for nuclear weapons. Let me say, against the North Korean nuclear threat, Japan first worked on missile defense in cooperation with the United States, standard missiles with the Aegis vessels. Now, Japanese are even more concerned. So now they have decided to acquire active defense capability. That is to attack North Korean bases, missile bases, to defend Japan. And for that purpose, you need to have a high quality, real-time intelligence. And the space assets can help provide a part of that sort of high grade intelligence. And for that reason, if Japan can feel comfortable that it can have additional active defense capability to attack North Korean missile sites even before they start attacking Japan. That can reduce the Japanese appetite for any acquisition of nuclear weapons.
Well,
So
I
far,
think, yeah.
Japan is confident with the U.S. extended nuclear deterrence. So the situation is a little different from Korea. But I think
why
that's
don't we let
argument I can make.
Okay, well, that's part of the argument. You're not going to get warning. You're not going to get command and control, much less active missile defense, or be able to hit moving targets without an awful lot of agile space capabilities. And you're going to have to make sure those things don't get knocked out. I think the latter is the issue that has not been joined. I think everyone thinks we have sanctuary. It's not true. Brian, the last comment.
Okay. What I want to say is, there's so many things we can cooperate. So everybody look at their favor and so forth, but we have no idea of urgency. We have no idea what comes first. And we are talking things in general, not specific. So my point is what we need to do is look at something specific and see how to solve it. So the most specific thing is, how do we deal with China taking Taiwan by force by 2026? Now, you may disagree with it, but please look at the specific case and exchange ideas. We don't exchange things. We just talk about things that we like to talk about. So that's our problem. No urgency, no priority, just keep talking.
All right. Well, in an effort to make sure that doesn't happen, I'm going to put an end to this meeting. And I do think that we touched on things that matter. I don't know to what extent this will be conveyed to other officials, but I do think there is an awfully lax sense of how much time we have. I suspect we have less time than the way we're behaving. That's my guess. So on that upbeat negative vote, I'm looking forward to more cooperation, collaboration. And next session, we'll send notes out to you as soon as we secure our French speaker. And that should be interesting. So on that note, I will say good evening to you all.